The Christ Law in the Star of Bethlehem, published 1913 by W.M.M. Kellogg, Los Angeles, California. A portrayal of the scientific law of healing through a soul experience and expression of the law of life, love, truth, as taught by our Master, Jesus the Christ. Preface. In placing the subject of the healing Christ consciousness before the reader, it is to be considered as the supreme law of perfection coming from the Father mind, or Spirit, by means of a diagram to be known as the Star of Bethlehem, will be portrayed a clear and comprehensive explanation of the scientific principle of right thoughts, and it must be understood that these thoughts, as states of consciousness, are to be our states of spiritual being. This work is essentially a discussion intended to reveal the utter falsity of evil as a living power with action in its own name. Through logical reasoning, in obedience to one spiritual law, and by reference to some of the axiomatic facts given by Jesus the Christ, it is hoped that through these means we may all come together on a common ground of understanding, as understanding in every way similar to that which we hold of the multiplication table, for the infallible and scientific law of good precludes all arguments as to its fact of being and righteousness as a law, even as this came multiplication table does. Same multiplication table does. It will be our daily work to establish in mind this law of perfection and to eschew the impotent and imperfect mortal sense concepts about material conditions, for we must enter into spiritual being. The object of this book is to show how Christ's teaching as a scientific law of right living is spiritual in essence and cannot be reduced to mortality and defiled therein. Mortality must be put off and spirituality put on through knowing the absolute scientific law of the Christ. Few people will realize that they, as well as the struggling mass of humanity seen upon our streets, are active mentalities only, constantly living, acting, and doing something, and if not guided into the lawful channel of perfect right and held therein, because of fact of knowing the law of good, just as we are held by knowing the multiplication table, then what is to keep them from going astray, following the carnal sense mind in the suggestion of the good and evil through the deceiving senses? For these people will continue living, moving, and doing something either good or bad, right or wrong. Now there is a perfect law of righteousness which is completely finished and can be understood. It is just as absolute and certain in its demonstration as the law of mathematics, and just as applicable to our daily life and its living. But hitherto it has not been orderly revealed in its Christ meaning of perfection, as given in the diagram of the Star of Bethlehem. For this reason, people generally have not been able to understand and use it through perception of its scientific perfection. This perfect law is not contaminated with or in any way influenced by man-made laws, for nothing can be added to it or taken from its already perfect being. It alone is sufficient to teach and guide us in all right and true living, and apart from it there is no right living. Through it would all the world come together into perfect harmony of being, under the influence of this perfect law of the righteous Christ, would all fighting and dominating mortal minds be laid aside, and the impotent mortal self be lost in the wonderful radiance and presence of the law of the Christ's perfection. The fundamental analysis and classification of ideas, as given in the diagram, to be known as the Star of Bethlehem, are to represent the principle or law of perfect idea entities as that mind of Christ. For mind and Christ are one, in which evil is not considered, neither has representation. The ideas as given in the star are intended as a beginning, with hope that study on the part of others may result in more perfect spiritual realizations and clearer soul experiences of this constructive law of good, therefore enlarging and eventually perfecting the system. To discern and arrange in right relation those perfect ideas, even to fill out the third and fourth circles, will be found to require a considerable ability to attain to perfection with its inherent dominion. But it can be attained here and now in a practical way sufficient to meet all our needs, and surely will correct our imperfect thoughts and all of their fearful manifestations. Moreover, we must not forget that we are commanded by the Lord, even as Abram was long ago, as recorded in Genesis 17:1, to walk before the Lord in his law and be perfect. In Matthew 5:48, our Master repeated this command, for he said, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." If it had not been possible for us to live in perfection, then would we not have been so commanded. But how is it possible for us to live perfectly when we don't know that law which makes us perfect? That is the Christ meaning of all things as a scientific law of perfection. And more, when we are not skilled in its use and application, even as we are in other sciences such as logic, music, or mathematics, the progressive people of today are beginning to look for a law of perfection, shorn of all mortal contamination, as of opinions, doubts, long-standing customs, social supremacy, material wealth, seeming power, ecclesiastical domination, etc. They want a principle of perfect being, apart from mortals, which they can absolutely trust and scientifically learn to know in perfection, with all hocus pocus eliminated, and be able to manifest it because they know it, and know how and why they know it. Again, they demanded an understandable science of perfect being, as for instance the perfect law of righteousness which gives forth everywhere the absolute freedom of spiritual thought, shorn of all mystery and bondage to material laws, which pretend to give a license of special privilege to some people for money, thinking thereby to limit God's law or even to guide it in its perfect action. The law, as given in the Star of Bethlehem, portrays the perfect principle of mind's action, substance, and perfection as the one Christ meaning of life, love, truth, which is the one meaning of all created beings. This law of the perfect Christ overcomes all other laws taking their place, because of the satisfying and final testimony of perfection given by Spirit to our spirit, which testimony is not contaminated with impotent mortality.